Mail-order bride battles. Harsh winter with fierce resolve. The arrival, Clara Whitmore pressed her gloved fingers to the left side of her face, feeling the familiar ridges and valleys of scarred flesh beneath the worn fabric. The train's whistle shrieked through the Colorado morning, and her stomach clenched with the same violence that had marked her skin 3 years prior. Through the grimy window, she watched Millbrook's weathered buildings emerge from the prairie like broken teeth against the November sky. "Don't touch the scars," she commanded herself, dropping her hand to smooth her dark traveling dress. The habit betrayed her every time, that unconscious reaching towards the damaged skin when fear crept close. She'd practiced this moment in her small Boston boarding house room, standing before the cracked mirror, rehearsing words that might explain what Thomas Brennan would see when she stepped off this train. The locomotive shuddered to a halt with a great hiss of steam. Clara's reflection caught in the window. The right side of her face still pretty, enough dark hair severely pinned, gray eyes clear and determined. But the left side. She turned away from her own image and gathered her single carpet bag, the weight of her entire life, fitting easily in her hands. The fire that had claimed Clara's beauty came on a Tuesday in October, 3 years past. She'd been working the late shift at Lowell Mill, tending the spinning frames in the suffocating heat of the factory floor. The memory still visited her dreams, the acrid smell of burning cotton, the screams of trapped girls, the searing pain as falling timber pinned her beneath blazing debris. She'd awakened 2 weeks later in the charity hospital, her left cheek and neck wrapped in bandages that couldn't hide the truth. The other girls who'd survived spoke of her bravery, how she'd helped push younger workers toward the exits before the roof collapsed. But bravery, Clara learned, didn't make the mirror kinder. The mill offered her a settlement, $50 and dismissal. Scarred workers unsettled the others, they explained with false gentleness. Clara took the money and found work where her appearance mattered less, scrubbing floors in office buildings after dark, taking in mending by lamplight, anything that kept her fed in the boarding house room she could barely afford. It was Mrs. Henley, her landlady, who'd first shown her the matrimonial advertisements in the newspaper. "Fresh start out west," the woman had suggested with the practiced kindness of someone eager to see a difficult tenant depart. "Men need wives out there, not ornaments." Clara had stared at the small print 4 hours before finally responding to Thomas Brennan's advertisement. "Successful cattle rancher seeks capable wife for Colorado territory. Must be of good character and willing to work. Appearance less important than virtue." His letters had been brief but encouraging. He'd asked for no photograph, which Clara took as providence. She'd written honestly about her circumstances, orphaned, working class, willing to labor, but the scars remained her secret. How could one explain such disfigurement in a letter? Better to trust that a man seeking capability over beauty might prove understanding. She'd spent her savings on the train ticket and the simplest wedding dress she could find, a brown wool that would serve afterward for church and town occasions. The 3-day journey had been a testament to endurance, her small store of food and water stretched thin, the hard wooden seat punishing her back as mile after mile of prairie rolled past. Now stepping onto the platform with her bag clutched tight, Clara felt the bite of Colorado wind against her exposed skin. The scars always felt the cold more keenly, the damaged nerve endings sending sharp warnings of the approaching winter. She pulled her threadbare cloak closer and searched the scattered crowd for a man matching Thomas Brennan's description, tall, brown-haired, wearing a black hat. She spotted him near the station house, exactly as he described himself in his letters. He stood with the confidence of prosperity, his wool coat well-tailored, his boots polished despite the dusty platform. Clara's heart hammered as she approached, her right side turned toward him, buying herself a few more seconds of being the woman he'd imagined. "Mr. Brennan." Her voice came out steadier than she'd hoped. He turned, and she watched his face transform in the space of a heartbeat. His smile began warm and expectant, then froze as his gaze traveled across her features. His brown eyes fixed on the twisted skin of her left cheek, the way the scarring pulled at the corner of her mouth, the ropey texture that disappeared beneath her collar. "Dear God," he breathed, stepping backward as if she carried contagion. What happened to you?" Clara forced herself to stand straight, though everything in her wanted to flee. "There was a fire at the mill where I worked. I know I should have told you, but..." "Should have told me..." His voice rose, drawing attention from other passengers and townspeople. "You should have told me that you looked like..." He gestured helplessly at her face, unable to finish the sentence. I'm still the same woman who wrote to you, Clara said quietly, aware that curious eyes were gathering around them. My character hasn't changed. Character, Thomas Brennan's laugh held no humor. I asked for a wife, not someone who'd frighten children. This is false advertising, plain and simple. The words hit like physical blows. Clara felt the familiar burning behind her eyes, but she'd learned long ago that tears only made people more uncomfortable around her damaged face. Mr. Brennan, please. I've come so far, and you can go right back. He pulled a few coins from his pocket and thrust them at her. For your return ticket. I won't be held responsible for your deception. Clara stared at the money in his outstretched palm, barely enough for a meal, let alone passage back to Boston. Around them, the platform had grown quiet, except for the wind and the distant lowing of cattle. She could feel the weight of watching eyes, the mixture of pity and curiosity that always followed her now. I haven't enough for the full fare, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Then you should have thought of that before you came here under false pretenses. Thomas Brennan dropped the coins at her feet and tipped his hat with mocking courtesy. Good day, Miss Whitmore. I trust you'll find some other arrangement. He strode away toward a waiting wagon, leaving Clara standing alone on the platform with her carpet bag and the scattered coins at her feet. The November wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing across the wooden planks, and she tasted the grit of shame between her teeth. Slowly, she knelt to gather the money, aware that her humiliation was now part of Millbrook's afternoon entertainment. Her fingers trembled as she collected the coins, not from cold, but from the familiar rage that burned in her chest whenever the world reminded her of what she'd lost in that fire. Capable wife, she thought bitterly, rising to her feet with as much dignity as she could summon. Appearance less important than virtue. The lies people told themselves were always the cruelest ones. As Thomas Brennan's wagon disappeared down the dusty main street, Clara Whitmore stood alone on the platform of a town that had already rejected her, with winter coming fast and nowhere left to run. The storm. The general store smelled of leather coffee beans and the particular mustiness of wool goods long stored. Clara had found work there by the grace of Martha Henderson, a stern-faced woman whose Christian duty outweighed her natural caution about hiring someone so obviously marked by misfortune. Mind you keep that hair pinned proper, Martha had said on Clara's first morning, not unkindly but with the practicality of someone who understood that customers preferred their commerce unmarked by reminders of life's cruelties. And perhaps you might arrange it to soften your profile. Clara had nodded, understanding the delicate suggestion. She'd grown expert at positioning herself to show her unmarked right side, at keeping busy with tasks that turned her away from curious stares. The work was familiar, counting inventory, measuring cloth, calculating change, and Martha proved fair, if not warm. For 2 weeks, Clara settled into a careful routine. She rented a small room above the store, took her meals quietly at the boarding house, and avoided the main street when she could. The coins Thomas Brennan had thrown at her feet wouldn't buy passage back to Boston, but perhaps by spring, she'd have saved enough to return to the familiar misery of factory work in city shadows. Then the blizzard came. It struck on a Tuesday morning in early December, the sky turning the color of old pewter before unleashing its fury. Clara had been restocking the medicinal shelves when the wind began to howl, rattling the store's windows like some great beast demanding entry. By noon, snow fell so thickly that the buildings across the street disappeared into white oblivion. No one's venturing out in this, Martha declared, peering through the frost-covered glass. We'd best close early and pray the roof holds. But as they prepared to lock up, hoofbeats thundered through the storm. The door burst open, admitting a swirl of snow and a tall man whose coat was crusted white with ice. He moved with surprising certainty despite the scarf wrapped around his eyes, his gloved hands finding the doorframe with practiced ease. Mrs. Henderson, he called, stamping snow from his boots. I need supplies. Storm's worse than expected, and I've got travelers stranded at my place. Clara stepped back into the shadows, instinctively turning her scarred side away, though she realized immediately the futility of the gesture. This was Nathan Cross. She'd heard his name whispered in the boarding house dining room, always accompanied by pitying sighs about the war wound that had stolen his sight. Nathan Cross, you fool man, Martha scolded, but her voice held affection. What are you doing out in weather like this? Found a family on the road about 5 miles out. he replied, unwrapping the scarf to reveal eyes the color of summer sky, unfocused but somehow alert. Wagon wheel busted, baby sick with fever. Got them to my place, but I need laudanum and whatever food stores you can spare. Clara, Martha called without thinking. Help Mr. Cross gather what he needs. Clara froze, but Nathan turned toward her voice with a slight smile. Clara, I don't believe we've met. Nathan Cross. He extended a hand in her general direction, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. His grip was warm and callous, gentle but strong. Clara Whitmore. She managed, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The lady from the train platform, he said quietly, and Clara's stomach dropped. Of course he had heard about her humiliation. News traveled fast in small towns, especially news as entertaining as hers had been. I'll gather the supplies, she said quickly, starting to pull away. But his hand tightened slightly on hers. I heard what happened, he continued, his voice pitched low enough that Martha couldn't overhear. Thomas Brennan's a fool, but that's nothing new. Are you settling in well otherwise? The simple kindness in his tone nearly undid her. Clara blinked back the sudden sting of tears, grateful for once that someone couldn't see her weakness. Well enough, thank you. Good. He released her hand and turned toward Martha. Now about those supplies. They worked together in companionable efficiency, Clara reading labels aloud while Nathan counted out coins and Martha wrapped packages against the cold. Clara found herself studying him when she thought he wouldn't notice the way he navigated space through memory and sound, the careful grace of his movements, the genuine warmth in his voice when he spoke of the stranded family. That should do it, Martha announced, tying the last bundle. But Nathan, you can't possibly make it back in this storm. As if summoned by her words, the wind shrieked louder, and something heavy, a tree branch or loose shutter, crashed against the building's side. Nathan cocked his head, listening to the storm's fury with the attention of someone who'd learned to read the world through sound alone. You're right, he admitted, but those folks need the medicine and the baby. Won't be helped if you freeze to death trying to reach them, Martha finished firmly. Clara, run upstairs and fetch my husband's old coat, the heavy one with the fur collar. Clara hurried up the narrow stairs, her mind churning. When she returned with the coat, Nathan was adjusting the packages in his saddlebags with methodical care. I could come with you, she heard herself say, the words surprising her as much as they did the others. Nathan paused in his preparations. That's kind of you, Miss Whitmore, but I've some experience with sick children, Clara pressed on, though her heart hammered at her own boldness. And you'll need help carrying everything through the snow. Absolutely not, Martha declared. Clara, it's far too dangerous. But Nathan stood still, his head tilted as if listening to something beyond the storm. Can you ride? He asked finally. Well enough. It was a lie. Clara had ridden perhaps a dozen times in her life, but something in his manner made her want to prove herself worthy of his strange faith. Then we leave now, before it gets worse. Nathan shouldered his pack and moved toward the door with that uncanny sureness. Stay close behind me. My horse knows the way, even when I can't see the trail. As Clara wrapped herself in Martha's husband's coat and followed Nathan into the howling white fury of the storm, she felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since the fire, someone had looked past her scars, or rather hadn't looked at all, and seen her simply as Clara, capable and willing to help. The snow stung her face like frozen needles as they mounted their horses, but the cold couldn't touch the warm glow of possibility that had kindled somewhere beneath her ribs. Whatever waited for them in the storm ahead, she was no longer facing it alone. Sanctuary. The Cross Ranch emerged from the white fury like a ship from fog, its windows glowing amber against the storm. Clara's hands were numb inside her gloves, her face raw from the wind, but she'd kept pace with Nathan through the treacherous journey. He'd called out warnings, low branch ahead, creek crossing here, guiding her as surely as if he could see every obstacle. The barn offered blessed relief from the wind. Nathan's horses nickered greetings to familiar stalls, and Clara slumped in her saddle, exhausted from the battle against the elements. You did well, Nathan said, dismounting with fluid grace. Many experienced riders wouldn't have attempted that journey. Clara slid from her horse less elegantly, her legs trembling from cold and fear. I wasn't certain I could manage it myself. Nathan moved through the barn with practiced efficiency, unsaddling his mount and gathering the medical supplies. Courage isn't the absence of fear, he said quietly. It's doing what needs doing despite the fear. The farmhouse was larger than Clara had expected, built solid against prairie winters. Warmth hit her like a physical embrace as they entered through the kitchen door. A young boy, 8 or 9 years old, rushed toward Nathan with obvious relief. "Uncle Nathan, I was so worried when the storm got bad. The baby's fever broke about an hour ago, but Mrs. Patterson's been asking for medicine for her headache." "This is my nephew Jamie," Nathan said, his hand finding the boy's shoulder with easy affection. "Jamie, this is Miss Clara Whitmore. She braved the storm to help us." Jamie turned curious eyes toward Clara, and she instinctively angled her face away. But the boy's gaze held only polite interest, no shock or revulsion. Perhaps growing up with a blind uncle had taught him to look beyond surface appearances. "Thank you for coming, Miss Clara," Jamie said with careful courtesy. "Mama always said we should help folks when they need it." The simple acceptance in his voice made Clara's throat tight. Your mama was very wise. They found the Patterson family in the front parlor where a makeshift bed had been arranged near the fireplace. The father, a weathered man with worried eyes, rose to greet them. His wife sat holding a baby who fussed fitfully, despite the broken fever. "Mr. Cross, you're a godsend," Patterson said, shaking Nathan's hand. "Don't know what we'd have done if you hadn't found us." "Miss Whitmore insisted on coming to help," Nathan replied. "She has experience with sick children." Clara felt all eyes turned toward her and fought the urge to retreat. Instead, she moved toward Mrs. Patterson, whose pale face showed the strain of worry and sleepless nights. "May I?" Clara asked gently, extending her arms toward the baby. Mrs. Patterson hesitated, her gaze catching on Clara's scarred cheek. But exhaustion won over prejudice, and she passed the infant across. The baby, a little girl, perhaps 6 months old, settled against Clara's chest with a soft sigh. "She likes you," Mrs. Patterson said with surprise. Clara had always been good with children. Before the fire, she'd helped care for the younger workers at the mill, the ones barely past childhood themselves. Babies didn't care about scars, they responded to gentle voices and steady hands. "What's her name?" Clara asked, settling into the rocking chair near the fire. "Elizabeth," Mrs. Patterson replied, "after my mother." "Hello, little Elizabeth," Clara murmured, and began humming a half-remembered lullaby. The baby's fussing quieted her tiny fist curling around Clara's finger. "How did you know to do that?" Nathan asked from across the room, his voice soft with something like wonder. "My mother used to hum that song," Clara replied without thinking, "for she died when I was small." She caught herself surprised by the admission. She rarely spoke of her childhood, of the brief years before the mill and the boarding house and the fire. But something about this warm room with the storm raging safely outside and a baby peaceful in her arms loosened her carefully guarded tongue. The evening passed in quiet domesticity. Clara helped prepare a simple meal while Nathan and Mr. Patterson discussed repairs needed for the wagon. Jamie proved an eager assistant, chattering about his schoolwork and the horses he helped tend. No one mentioned Clara's scars, though she caught Mrs. Patterson stealing curious glances when she thought Clara wasn't looking. It was Jamie who broke the careful politeness. "Does your face hurt?" he asked during supper, his child's directness cutting through adult pretense. "Jamie," Nathan warned gently, but Clara held up a hand. "It's all right," she said, meeting the boy's honest gaze. "It did hurt when it first happened. There was a fire at the place where I worked, but it doesn't hurt anymore." "Were you scared?" Jamie asked. Clara considered the question seriously. "Yes, I was very scared. But sometimes we have to be brave, even when we're frightened. Like coming out in the storm tonight." "Exactly like that." Jamie nodded, satisfied with her answer, and returned to his cornbread, as if scarred ladies were perfectly ordinary dinner companions. Clara caught Nathan listening with that focused attention he gave to conversations, a slight smile playing at his lips. After the Pattersons had settled for the night, Clara found herself alone with Nathan in the kitchen. He moved with easy familiarity, banking the fire and checking the locks while she tidied the last of the dishes. "You're good with children," he observed. "I like them. They see differently than adults do." Nathan paused in his tasks. "How do adults see you, Clara?" The question hung in the warm air between them. Clara's hand stilled on the dish towel and her heart beginning to race. No one had asked her that before, not directly, not with such gentle curiosity. "As something damaged," she said finally, "something that makes them uncomfortable. They look at my face and see their own fears reflected back what could happen to them, to their children. I remind them that the world isn't safe." "And how do you see yourself?" The question was even more dangerous than the first. Clara set down the towel with careful precision, her throat tight. I try not to see myself at all. Nathan moved closer, his steps careful but sure. That seems like a terrible waste. Of what? Of Clara Whitmore. He said her name like it meant something, like it carried weight beyond the damaged flesh that bore it. The woman who braved a blizzard to help strangers, who calmed a sick baby with a half-remembered lullaby, who answered a child's difficult questions with honesty instead of shame. Clara's breath caught. You can't see. I see with more than my eyes, Nathan interrupted softly. I hear the kindness in your voice when you speak to Jamie. I feel the gentleness in your hands when you held that baby. I sense the strength it took to climb on a horse and follow me into a storm. Tears she'd held back for 3 years suddenly threatened to spill. But if you could see my face, then I might be as foolish as Thomas Brennan. Nathan's voice carried quiet conviction. And I'd rather trust what I know of your character than what others might see in a mirror. The storm howled around the solid walls of the farmhouse, but inside Clara felt something frozen beginning to thaw. For the first time since the fire, someone had looked at her, truly looked in all the ways that mattered, and found her worthy. She was still afraid to believe it. 3 years of careful hiding, of positioning herself in shadows and turning away from curious stares couldn't be undone by one evening's kindness. But the seed of possibility had been planted, and despite her fears, Clara felt it beginning to grow. The storm raged for 3 days. On the first morning, Clara woke in the small guest room Nathan had prepared for her, disoriented by the unfamiliar comfort of clean sheets and a real mattress. Sunlight streamed through windows that looked out over snow-drifted pastures, and the silence after the wind's fury felt profound. She found Nathan in the kitchen, bacon sizzling in a cast-iron pan, while coffee brewed on the stove. He moved with the unconscious grace ordinaire. She was learning to associate with him, his hands finding what he needed without fumbling or hesitation. Good morning, he said without turning around. Sleep well. Better than I have in weeks. Clara tied an apron around her waist. What can I do to help? Jamie's doing morning chores. If you could see to the Pattersons' breakfast, I'd be grateful. Little Elizabeth was fussing again in the night. I think Mrs. Patterson could use the rest. They worked together in comfortable silence, Clara marveling at how naturally they'd fallen into domestic partnership. Nathan seemed to sense her movement, stepping aside when she needed to reach the stove, passing her items before she asked. It was as if they'd shared a kitchen for years instead of hours. The second day brought news that made Clara's stomach clench with dread. Jamie returned from checking the animals with word that he'd seen riders from town struggling through the drifts. Probably checking on folks, Nathan said, but Clara heard the careful neutrality in his voice. She was right to worry. By afternoon, Martha Henderson arrived with Dr. Samuel Wright, both bundled in heavy coats and riding horses that steamed in the cold air. Clara Whitmore, what in heaven's name are you doing here? Martha demanded before she'd even dismounted. The whole town's talking about how you disappeared in the storm. Clara felt the familiar burn of shame creep up her neck. I came to help with the stranded family. Alone with a man, Martha's voice carried the scandalized tone of a woman who trafficked in reputation as currency. Child, do you have any idea what people are saying? I imagine they're saying exactly what they always say about me, Clara replied quietly, her chin lifting in defiance. That I'm something unseemly that proper folks shouldn't have to see. DeWright, a kind-faced man in his 50s, stepped between them. Mrs. Henderson, Miss Whitmore's presence here likely saved that baby's life. Mrs. Patterson tells me the child wouldn't settle for anyone else. That's as may be, Martha sniffed, but appearances matter. A young woman can't just disappear with a man regardless of circumstances. Nathan emerged from the barn leading his horse. Clara watched his face change as he took in the scene, the careful blankness that suggested he'd heard every word. Mrs. Henderson, he said with cool politeness. Dr. Wright, I trust you found everyone well. The Pattersons are recovering nicely, Dr. Wright replied, though I understand Miss Whitmore has been instrumental in their care. She has. Nathan's voice warmed when he spoke of Clara. We've been fortunate to have her help. Martha's mouth pursed in disapproval. Nathan Cross, you know better than this. The girl's reputation is her own concern, Nathan interrupted with quiet steel. Miss Whitmore risked her life to help strangers. I won't hear her, Charity criticized. Clara felt a flutter of warmth at his defense, but Martha's words had already done their damage. She could imagine the conversations in town, the mail-order bride, who'd been rejected, now compromising herself with the blind rancher. The story would grow in the telling, becoming more sordid with each repetition. "I should return to town," she said quietly. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Cross." But Nathan stepped forward, his face set with determination. "The roads are still dangerous. Dr. Wright, would you say it's safe for travel?" The doctor glanced at the snow-heavy sky. "Not until the weather clears completely. I'd recommend at least another day." "Then Miss Whitmore stays until it's safe," Nathan declared with finality. That brooked no argument. Martha's lips tightened, but she could hardly argue with the doctor's medical opinion. "Very well, but Clara, you come straight to the store when you return. We'll discuss your situation." After the visitors left, Clara found herself alone with Nathan in the kitchen. The easy companionship of the morning had vanished, replaced by the weight of unspoken consequences. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I didn't think about how my being here would look." Nathan was quiet for a long moment, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Clara," he said carefully, "what do you want from life?" The question startled her. "I don't understand. Do you just want to spend your days measuring cloth and avoiding curious stares? Do you want to save pennies for years just to return to a city that holds nothing but bad memories?" His voice grew intense. "Or do you want something more?" Clara's heart hammered. "What are you asking?" Nathan turned toward her, his unseeing eyes somehow finding hers with uncanny accuracy. "I'm asking if you might consider staying. Not just until the weather clears, staying permanently, as my wife." The words hung in the air like a held breath. Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet, possibility and terror warring in her chest. "You don't know me," she whispered. "I know enough." Nathan stepped closer, his voice gentle but certain. "I know you're brave and kind and good with children. I know you don't flinch when life gets difficult. I know I've never felt as comfortable with anyone as I have these past 3 days. But your sight, if it ever returned, won't change what I've learned of your character." Nathan reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her hand. "Clara, I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking if you might consider building something real here. Something that belongs to both of us." Clara stared at their joined hands, her mind reeling. Everything sensible told her to refuse to protect herself from another inevitable rejection. But something deeper, something that had been sleeping since the fire stirred to life at his words. "I need time to think," she managed. Nathan nodded, releasing her hand with obvious reluctance. "Of course. But Clara, don't let Martha Henderson or anyone else make this decision for you. You've hidden long enough." That night, as the storm finally began to clear, Clara lay awake listening to the house settle around her. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond mere survival. It terrified her more than any blizzard ever could. Complications. The morning Clara returned to town, she found Millbrook buzzing with gossip like a disturbed hive. Whispered conversations stopped when she passed, resuming behind her back with obvious relish. Mrs. Henderson greeted her at the store with thin-lipped disapproval and a lecture about propriety that lasted the better part of an hour. 3 days, Clara. 3 days alone with that man and the whole territory talking about it. Martha's hands worked nervously at her apron strings. "I've tried to defend you, but there's only so much a body can do against wagging tongues." Clara folded bolts of fabric with mechanical precision, her face carefully blank. She'd learned to armor herself against such judgment, to let the words slide past without taking root. But Nathan's proposal had left her emotions too close to the surface, too vulnerable to the opinions she'd once ignored. "Nothing improper happened," she said quietly. "That's not the point, and you know it. Appearances matter in a small town. A woman's reputation is apparently more fragile than a soap bubble." Clara finished, her voice sharper than intended. "I help nurse a sick baby and assist with household chores. If that's scandal, then half the women in this territory are fallen creatures." Martha's eyes narrowed. "Don't take that tone with me, young lady. I gave you work when no one else would, and I won't have you." The store's bell chimed, interrupting the lecture. Both women turned to see Thomas Brennan entering, his expensive coat brushing against the doorframe. Clara's stomach dropped, but she kept her expression neutral. "Mrs. Henderson," Thomas said with false cheer, removing his hat. Miss Whitmore, I trust you are both well. Well enough, Martha replied with careful politeness. Thomas Brennan's ranch was one of her best customers, a fact that colored every interaction. Thomas's gaze found Clara and lingered on her scarred cheek with obvious distaste. I hear you've been expanding your social circle, Miss Whitmore, making new friends during the storm. The implied insult hit its mark. Clara felt heat creep up her neck, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. I helped care for stranded travelers, if that's what you mean. Oh, I think we both know exactly what I mean. Thomas's smile was cold and predatory. Though I suppose a woman in your circumstances must take whatever attention she can find. Mr. Brennan, Martha said sharply, there's no call for such talk. But Thomas was just getting started. He'd clearly come here with purpose, and Clara's presence had given him the perfect opportunity to sharpen his cruelty. I've been thinking about our first meeting, he continued, circling closer like a cat with a wounded mouse, about how you deceived me with your letters, made me believe I was getting a proper wife when you knew full well you were damaged goods. Clara's hands clenched into fists, but she kept her voice level. I never claimed to be perfect, Mr. Brennan. Perfect. Thomas laughed, the sound ugly in the store's confines. My dear girl, there's a considerable distance between perfect and, well, whatever it is you've become. I wonder what poor Nathan Cross would think if he could actually see what he's apparently taken such a shine to. The words hit like physical blows. Clara felt a familiar burn of shame and fury warring in her chest. But before she could respond, the store's bell chimed again. Nathan Cross stepped inside Jamie at his side, both carrying empty burlap sacks for shopping. The sudden silence was deafening. Good morning, Mrs. Henderson, Nathan said pleasantly, though Clara noticed the slight tension in his shoulders. Mr. Brennan, Miss Whitmore. His greeting to her was warm, openly affectionate in a way that made Thomas's eyes narrow with calculation. Nathan, Thomas said with false bonhomie. How convenient. I was just discussing Miss Whitmore with Mrs. Henderson, sharing some concerns about her situation. Nathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. What concerns might those be? Well, her reputation, of course. A single woman spending days alone with a man. People talk, you understand. And given her unfortunate circumstances, she can hardly afford more scandal. Jamie looked between the adults with the sharp intuition of childhood, sensing undercurrents he didn't fully understand. Clara wanted to disappear through the floorboards rather than have the boy witness this humiliation. Miss Whitmore helped save a family's life, Nathan said quietly, but Clara heard the steel beneath his calm tone. If that's scandalous, then this town has lost its moral compass. Thomas's smile turned predatory. Come now, Nathan. We both know why you've taken such an interest in the lady. A man in your condition can't afford to be particular about appearances. The insult hung in the air like poison. Nathan went very still, his hands at his sides, and Clara saw something dangerous flicker across his face. Careful, Brennan, Nathan said softly. You're walking on thin ice. But Thomas, emboldened by Nathan's apparent restraint, pressed his advantage. I'm simply speaking truth. A blind man and a scarred woman. It's almost poetic, isn't it? Both of you settling for what no one else would want. The words hit Clara like a slap. Everything Nathan had said about her worth, about seeing beyond surface appearances, suddenly felt like pity masquerading as affection. The old familiar voice in her head whispered its poison. You're something damaged. Something no whole person could truly love. That's enough, Martha said sharply, but Thomas ignored her. Mark my words, Nathan, you'll regret this infatuation when the novelty wears off. A man needs a wife who can represent him properly in society, not someone who frightens children and makes decent folk uncomfortable. Nathan took a step forward, his face hard as granite. Thomas, you have exactly 10 seconds to apologize to Miss Whitmore before I forget I'm a gentleman. Something in Nathan's voice must have penetrated Thomas's arrogance. The rancher glanced between Nathan's tense posture and Clara's pale face, then shrugged with affected indifference. No offense intended, of course, simply looking out for an old friend's interests. He settled his hat on his head with deliberate casualness. Good day, ladies, Nathan. He strolled out as if he hadn't just shattered something precious in the room's confines. Clara stood frozen, the echoes of his words ringing in her ears. Both of you settling for what no one else would want. Clara, Nathan said gently, but she couldn't bear the pity she imagined in his voice. I should get back to work, she managed, turning toward the fabric counter. Uncle Nathan, Jamie's young voice cut through the tension. Why was that man so mean? Nathan knelt to his nephew's level, his hands finding the boy's shoulders with automatic gentleness. Some people carry meanness inside them, like a sickness, Jamie. It makes them want to hurt others. But Miss Clara helped us. She made Mrs. Patterson's baby feel better. Yes, she did. Nathan's voice was soft with something that might have been grief. She's a good person, and good people don't deserve cruel words. Clara's throat closed around unshed tears. She wanted to believe Nathan's defense wanted to trust in his earlier words about her worth. But Thomas's poison had found its mark, awakening every doubt she'd carried since the fire. A blind man and a scarred woman. The phrase echoed in her mind as she mechanically folded fabric and tallied figures. Was that all? They were two damaged people clinging to each other because no one else would have them. Over the following days, Clara threw herself into work with desperate intensity. She arrived early, stayed late, and avoided the parts of town where she might encounter Nathan or anyone else who'd witnessed her humiliation. But Millbrook was too small for complete avoidance, and Nathan too determined to let her retreat completely. He came to the store 3 times that week, always with some excuse. Supplies needed messages for Martha, Jamie requiring something from town. Each visit was brief but pointed his concern for Clara, evident in every carefully chosen word. You're avoiding me, he said on his 3rd visit when Martha had stepped into the back room. I'm working, Clara replied without looking up from her ledger. Clara, his voice was gentle but insistent. Don't let Thomas Brennan's poison take root. You know what kind of man he is. Do I? Clara set down her pen and finally met his unseeing gaze. Or do I just know what kind of man I hoped he wasn't? Nathan was quiet for a moment, and Clara could see him choosing his words carefully. What did he say that frightened you so much? The question cut too close to bone. Clara turned away, busying herself with straightening already neat shelves. Nothing I hadn't thought myself. That we're both settling. His directness startled her. Clara's hand stilled on a bolt of calico, her heart hammering. Aren't we? No. Nathan's voice was firm, certain. Clara, look at me. Despite the impossibility of the request, Clara found herself turning toward him. Nathan's face was serious, his jaw set with determination. I didn't ask you to marry me because I'm blonde and you're scarred, and we're both grateful for scraps of affection. I asked because in 3 days you became more essential to my life than anyone has been since my sister died. Clara's breath caught. Nathan had never mentioned his sister before, never spoken of the loss that had left him caring for Jamie. You don't understand, she whispered. You can't see what everyone else sees when they look at me. You're right. Nathan stepped closer, his voice intense. I can't see the scars that make you think you're less than you are. I can't see the damage that convinces you no one could love you completely. And I thank God for that blindness, because it lets me know Clara Whitmore, as she truly is, not as the world has convinced her she should be. Tears she'd held back for days suddenly spilled over. Clara pressed her hands to her face, trying to hide the breakdown she could no longer contain. Nathan's arms came around her, then strong and warm and infinitely gentle. She should have pulled away. They were in a public place, and more scandal was the last thing she needed. But his embrace felt like sanctuary, like the first safe harbor she'd found since the fire. I'm so tired of being afraid, she whispered against his shoulder. Then stop, Nathan murmured into her hair. Stop hiding. Stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. Stop letting cruel people define your worth. Clara wanted to believe him. Standing in the circle of his arms, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, she almost could. But 3 years of careful hiding, of measuring her value by others' comfort with her appearance, couldn't be undone by one moment of kindness. What if they're right, she asked quietly. What if we are just 2 broken people mistaking gratitude for something more? Nathan pulled back enough to frame her face with his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears with infinite tenderness. His touch traced the scarred skin of her left cheek as gently as it did the unmarked, right, no hesitation or revulsion in his caress. Then we'll build something beautiful from our broken pieces, he said simply. But Clara, I don't believe that's what this is. Do you? Before she could answer, the store's bell chimed. Martha returned from the back room, took one look at their embrace, and cleared her throat pointedly. I think you'd best continue this conversation elsewhere, she said with the weary tone of someone who'd given up trying to control an uncontrollable situation. Nathan stepped back reluctantly, but his hand found Clara's and held fast. Will you come to dinner Hyundai? Jamie's been asking about you. Clara hesitated, aware that acceptance meant stepping fully into the light, making her choice known to the entire town. But Nathan's touch anchored her, reminded her that hiding had brought her nothing but loneliness. Yes, she said quietly. I'd like that. Nathan's smile transformed his face, bringing warmth to his features that made Clara's heart skip. Good, I'll come for you after church. After he left, Clara stood in the store's sudden quiet, her fingertips still tingling from his touch. Martha watched her with shrewd eyes, taking in Clara's flushed cheeks and the new light in her expression. You're really going to do this, aren't you? Martha asked. Marry him, I mean. Clara met her gaze steadily. I think I am. Martha sighed, but her expression wasn't entirely disapproving. Well, God knows you could do worse. Nathan Cross is a good man, even if he is— She gestured vaguely toward her eyes. Blind, Clara supplied. Yes, he is, but he sees everything that matters. And for the first time since the fire, Clara began to believe that might include seeing her own worth, the reckoning. The worst blizzard in 20 years struck Millbrook in late January, howling down from the mountains with a fury that made Clara's first Colorado storm seem like a gentle snowfall. For 3 days, the wind screamed around the store's walls, while snow piled against the windows in drifts that blocked out the light. Clara had been staying late reconciling the week's accounts by lamplight when Martha burst through the back door with panic written across her face. Clara, thank God you're still here. Dr. Wright just sent word there's been an accident on the mountain road. A wagon overturned in the storm, and they think there might be survivors trapped. Clara's blood went cold. Who was traveling in this weather? The Richardson family from the next valley over. They were bringing their youngest boy to see Dr. Wright. The child's been sick with pneumonia. Martha's voice cracked with worry. Tom Richardson, his wife, and 3 little ones. The rescue party can't find them in this white hell. Clara's mind immediately went to Nathan. In weather like this, every able-bodied man in town would be called upon to search, blind or not. The thought of him out in the storm's fury, navigating treacherous mountain roads he couldn't see, made her stomach clench with terror. Where's the search party gathering? She asked, already reaching for her coat. Clara, no. Martha caught her arm. You can't possibly think to go out in this. It's madness. But Clara was already wrapping her scarf around her throat, her movements sharp with purpose. I can help. I know these mountains now, and I've experience with sick children. The men won't want a woman along, especially not— Martha caught herself, but the unfinished words hung heavy in the air. Especially not you. Then they'll have to refuse me to my face, Clara said with quiet steel. I won't sit here warm and safe while children freeze to death on the mountain. The storm hit her like a physical assault the moment she stepped outside. Snow whipped around her in blinding sheets, and the wind tried to tear the breath from her lungs. She bent her head against the fury and pushed toward the livery stable where she could see lanterns gathering through the white chaos. A dozen men clustered around the stable entrance, their faces grim as they checked supplies and saddled horses. Clara recognized most of them shopkeepers and farmers' men who'd never spoken to her directly, but whose eyes had lingered on her scars with uncomfortable curiosity. Nathan stood near the back of the group, his face set with determination as he adjusted his horse's bridle. Clara's heart clenched at the sight of him preparing to ride into danger he couldn't fully see. I'm coming with you, she announced, her voice cutting through the wind. The men turned as one, their expressions ranging from surprise to outright hostility. Thomas Brennan, who'd apparently appointed himself leader of the expedition, stepped forward with a sneer. Miss Whitmore, this is no place for a woman, especially one with your limitations. My limitations? Clara's voice rose, anger burning through her fear. What limitations might those be, Mr. Brennan? The inability to sit idle while children suffer. Now see here, began Pete Morris, the blacksmith. This is dangerous work, ma'am. We can't be worrying about your safety when we've got families to find. You won't need to worry about me, Clara shot back. I've ridden through storms before, and I know more about treating sick children than half of you combined. The lady has a point, said Dr. Vaughn, Wright emerging from the shadows. If we do find survivors, medical knowledge will be essential. Miss Whitmore proved her capabilities during the last storm. But Thomas wasn't finished. "This is exactly the sort of reckless behavior we've come to expect," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the wind. "First compromising herself with Cross, now wanting to ride out with a dozen men. The woman has no sense of propriety." The words hit their mark, and Clara felt the familiar burn of shame creep up her throat. Around her, she could sense the men's discomfort, their reluctance to be associated with someone whose reputation had become town gossip. "That's enough," Nathan's voice cut through the discussion like a blade. He moved toward the group with purpose, his face hard with anger. "Miss Whitmore's character is beyond reproach, and her offer of help should be accepted with gratitude, not suspicion." "Stay out of this, Cross," Thomas snapped. "Your judgment when it comes to this woman is hardly reliable." "My judgment is perfectly clear," Nathan replied coldly. "Unlike yours, it's not clouded by petty cruelty and wounded pride." The two men faced each other across the snowy ground, tension crackling between them like lightning. Clara could see the situation spiraling toward violence, and the Richardson family was still lost somewhere in the storm. "Stop," she said quietly, but her voice carried in the sudden hush. "Please just stop." She stepped forward, moving into the circle of lantern light, where every man could see her clearly. The scarred side of her face, usually hidden in shadow, was illuminated starkly against the white of the snow. "You're right, Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I have no sense of propriety. No proper woman would stand here arguing while children freeze to death. No proper woman would risk her reputation to help strangers." She turned, slowly meeting each man's gaze in turn. "But I'm not a proper woman, am I? I'm something else entirely, something marked, something damaged. And perhaps that's exactly what this situation requires." Clara pulled back her scarf, fully exposing the twisted scars that ran down her neck. Several men shifted uncomfortably, but she didn't flinch from their stares. "These scars came from fire," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "From burning timber that fell on me while I helped other girls escape a blazing factory. I know what it means to fight for your life when the world is trying to kill you. I know what it feels like to be trapped and afraid and certain that no one will come." Her eyes found Nathan in the crowd, drawing strength from his steady presence. "Those children out there don't care if I'm scarred. They don't care if my presence makes you uncomfortable or if my reputation is in tatters. They just need someone brave enough to find them." She moved toward her horse, her movements decisive. "I'm going with or without your permission. You can waste more time arguing, or you can accept that sometimes the most unlikely people are exactly what the situation demands." For a moment, no one moved. Then Dr. Wright swung into his saddle with a grunt of approval. "The lady's right," he declared. "We're burning daylight while children suffer. Anyone who wants to come, mount up. Anyone who doesn't, stay here where it's warm." The rebuke stung, and one by one the men began mounting their horses. Thomas Brennan's face was purple with rage, but even he couldn't afford to appear cowardly in front of the others. Nathan rode up beside Clara as the group prepared to move out. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said quietly. "Probably both," Clara admitted, "but I couldn't let them waste more time on my account." "Clara," Nathan's voice was soft, meant for her ears alone. "What you said about the fire, about helping others escape, was true," she finished. "I've never spoken of it before, but it was true." Nathan nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. "I thought it might be. Heroes often carry their courage like scars, visible to some, invisible to others." Before Clara could respond, Dr. Wright called out orders, and the rescue party plunged into the storm. The next hours blurred into a nightmare of howling wind and stinging snow. They followed the mountain road as far as they could, then spread out in search patterns when the trail became impassable. Clara's face went numb with cold and ice formed on her eyelashes, but she pressed on with grim determination. It was her voice that first heard the crying. "Wait!" she called out, holding up her hand to stop the search party. "Listen!" Through the wind's howl came a faint sound, a child's wail, thin and desperate. Clara wheeled her horse toward the sound, following it down a steep embankment where snow had drifted deep around an overturned wagon. "Here!" she shouted back to the others. "They're here!" The scene that greeted them was heartbreaking. Tom Richardson lay unconscious beside the wagon's wreckage, blood frozen on his forehead. His wife huddled with their 3 children in the meager shelter of the overturned vehicle, all of them blue with cold and barely conscious. Clara was off her horse before it stopped moving, wading through hip-deep snow to reach the family. The youngest child, a boy of perhaps 3, lay frighteningly still in his mother's arms. "Mrs. Richardson," Clara called, touching the woman's shoulder gently. "I'm Clara Whitmore. We've come to take you home." The woman's eyes fluttered open, unfocused, with cold and exhaustion. "My baby," she whispered. "He stopped crying an hour ago. I think he's—" Clara took the child from his mother's numb arms, pressing her ear to his tiny chest. There, faint but steady, she heard the whisper of a heartbeat. "He's alive," she announced, cradling the boy against her chest. Weak but alive. The rescue became a race against time and elements. While the men constructed makeshift stretchers and loaded the injured family, Clara worked to warm the children with her own body heat, singing the same lullaby she'd hummed to baby Elizabeth weeks before. The journey back to town tested every ounce of their endurance. The wind tried to tear them from their saddles, and the snow fell so thickly that they could barely see the horse ahead. But Clara held the Richardson boy close, feeling his breathing grow stronger with each mile they covered. When they finally reached Millbrook, the entire town had gathered at Dr. Wright's clinic, word of the rescue having spread despite the storm. Clara dismounted stiffly, her arms cramped from holding the child, and found herself surrounded by grateful faces. "Miss Clara," Mrs. Henderson said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "You saved them. You saved them all." But Clara wasn't listening to the praise. Her attention was fixed on Nathan, who sat his horse nearby with an expression she'd never seen before, something between wonder and recognition, as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time. "You beautiful, brave, impossible woman," he said quietly, his voice carrying despite the crowd. "Do you have any idea what you've done tonight?" Clara looked around at the faces surrounding her, no longer filled with pity or discomfort, but with respect and gratitude. The scars that had defined her for so long suddenly seemed less like marks of damage and more like badges of courage. "I did what anyone would do," she said simply. "No." Nathan dismounted and moved toward her with purpose. "You did what Clara Whitmore would do, what the woman I love would do." The words hung in the storm-charged air like a benediction. Clara's breath caught her heart hammering against her ribs. Nathan. But he was already reaching for her, his hands finding her face with unerring accuracy. Snow swirled around them, and the entire town watched, but Clara could only see his eyes, blind, but seeing everything that mattered. "I love you," he said again, his voice strong and certain. "Not because we're both broken, not because I can't see your scars. I love you because of who you are, brave and kind and fierce as a mountain storm. I love the woman who rides into blizzards to save children, who speaks truth when others traffic in lies, who sees worth in a damaged man that he couldn't see in himself." Clara felt something break open in her chest, not the familiar fracture of pain, but the cracking of walls she'd built to protect a heart that had forgotten how to hope. "I love you too," she whispered, the words coming easier than breathing. "I love your gentle strength and your stubborn faith in the way you see me as whole when the whole world sees me as broken." Nathan's smile transformed his face, bringing light to features carved by suffering. "Then marry me, Clara Whitmore. Not because it's practical or because we're settling for what we can get. Marry me because love like this deserves to be celebrated." Around them, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Clara heard only the steady beat of her own heart, no longer afraid, no longer ashamed, but finally free. Epilogue. Spring 6 months later. Clara Cross stood in the doorway of her kitchen, watching her husband and nephew work in the garden outside. Spring had come early to Colorado, painting the world in shades of green and gold that made her heart sing with possibility. Nathan knelt beside a row of seedlings, his hands gentle as he guided Jamie in proper planting technique. The boy chattered constantly, describing everything his uncle couldn't see: the color of the soil, the shape of the leaves, the way the light fell across the growing things. "Aunt Clara's coming," Jamie announced, looking up from his work. "She's got that smile she gets when she's watching us." Nathan turned toward the house, his face brightening with the smile she'd learned to treasure above all earthly things. "The one that means she's planning mischief." "The one that means she's happy," Jamie corrected, with the wisdom of a child who'd learned to read the language of love. Clara stepped into the garden, her blue dress rustling against the young plants. The wedding ring on her finger caught the sunlight, sending tiny rainbows dancing across her scarred hand. "Jacquard," Wright stopped by with news. She announced, settling onto the wooden bench Nathan had built beneath the apple tree. Mrs. Richardson is expecting another baby in the fall. God's blessings multiply, Nathan said softly, reaching for her hand. How is little Tom doing? Growing stronger every day. His mother says he asks about Miss Clara with the brave face constantly. Clara's voice held wonder, still surprised after all these months to be remembered with love rather than pity. The Richardson boy's words had spread through Millbrook Park like wildfire. The brave face, Richardson. Somehow a 3-year-old's innocent observation had transformed the way the town saw her scars, not as marks of damage, but as evidence of courage. Speaking of blessings, Nathan said, his tone carefully casual. Martha Henderson mentioned she might need extra help at the store come winter. Clara raised an eyebrow. Oh, and why might that be? Nathan's grin was answer enough. Clara felt her breath catch her free hand moving instinctively to her still flat stomach. How long have you known? She asked. About a week. You've been humming that lullaby again, the one you sang to baby Elizabeth. You only do that when you're feeling particularly maternal. Clara laughed, marveling once again at her husband's ability to see what others missed. And you're pleased. Nathan's answer came in the form of arms that pulled her close, in lips that found hers with gentle certainty. Against her mouth, he whispered words that had become their private liturgy. You beautiful, brave, impossible woman. What did I do to deserve you? Clara's scarred fingers traced the strong line of his jaw, her touch as reverent as prayer. You saw me, she whispered back. Not my damage, not my shame, just me. Jamie made a sound of disgust from his place among the vegetables. Are you two going to get all mushy again? Because I need to finish these beans before dinner. No, and they broke apart laughing, but Nathan's hand remained linked with Clara's as they watched the boy return to his work. In the distance, the mountains stood guard over their valley, their peaks still crowned with snow despite the spring warmth. I have something for you, Nathan said, suddenly reaching into his shirt pocket. A wedding gift I have been saving for the right moment. He pulled out a small wooden carving, placing it carefully in Clara's palm. It was a bird, a phoenix. She realized its wings spread wide as if rising from flames. The wood was warm from his body heat, polished smooth by careful hands. I made it myself, Nathan said quietly. Spent the winter evenings working on it while you read aloud. I wanted to give you something that showed, that reminded you, that I rose from the fire. Clara finished, her voice thick with tears. That the flames didn't destroy me, they made me stronger. That they made you who you are, Nathan corrected. The woman who saves children and rides through storms and loves a broken-down cavalry officer with everything she has. Clara closed her fingers around the carving, feeling its weight like a blessing in her palm. Outside her kitchen window, Jamie's laughter rang across the garden, bright as morning bells. Inside her body, new life stirred with the promise of tomorrow. She had been Clara Whitmore, scarred to shame, convinced of her own unworthiness. Now she was Clara Cross, loved, loving, finally and completely home. The fire had marked her, it was true. But Nathan was right, the flames hadn't destroyed her. They had forged her into something stronger, something beautiful, something worthy of the love that surrounded her like spring sunshine. And in the warmth of that love, Clara finally understood the truth she'd been too afraid to believe. She had always been worthy. The scars were simply proof that she had survived everything life could throw at her and emerged not broken, but unbreakable. In the garden of their new life, surrounded by growing things and endless possibility, Clara Cross smiled her brave face toward the future and felt at last the fierce joy of coming home to herself.